The storm began as a whisper on the radio. Forecasters warned of freezing rain sweeping across the region, but no one expected the scale of what arrived. By evening, power lines bowed under the weight of ice, roads were coated in glass, and trees snapped in the dark with sharp, echoing cracks. In that chaos, a young mother and her 6-year-old daughter vanished from their small rural home. Their disappearance would grow into one of the most haunting mysteries the community would ever face. The mother, 29-year-old Amanda Hayes, lived on a quiet road about 2 miles outside the nearest town. She worked part-time at a diner, raising her daughter Lily with help from neighbors while her husband traveled for long shifts at a manufacturing plant out of county. Friends described her as cautious and protective, not the type to take risks, especially during storms. But on that particular night, when the lights in her house began flickering and the cold seeped through thin walls, she made a decision that remains at the heart of the mystery. She packed her daughter up, and the two of them disappeared into the ice. Neighbors remembered that the storm seemed alive. One man later recalled hearing what he thought was a gunshot outside, only to realize it was the sound of an oak branch shattering under the weight of ice. Another woman, living 3 houses down, said her own power had gone out, leaving her stranded with no heat, and she suspected Amanda might have been frightened by the same. But what unsettled everyone was the silence that followed. When the storm cleared the next morning, the Hayes home stood dark and empty. Inside, investigators later found signs the two had been preparing to leave. Amanda's heavy winter coat was missing from its hook by the door, along with Lily's small boots. A half-packed bag rested on the kitchen table, containing canned food, a flashlight, and a blanket. The front door was locked, the back door bolted, and the family dog had been left behind. It was as though Amanda had planned for a quick trip, fully expecting to return. Yet, no one ever saw them come back. Police were notified after Amanda's sister called the house repeatedly with no answer. Officers arrived to find the driveway blanketed in ice with no visible tire tracks. The yard showed nothing but jagged frozen footprints leading toward the family carport and then vanishing under layers of hard snow. The car itself was gone. For investigators, it was both a clue and a curse. Amanda and Lily had left in the vehicle, but where they went was impossible to trace. At the time, conditions on the roads were near catastrophic. Entire sections of highway were shut down after semi-trucks jackknifed on ice. Local authorities warned drivers to stay off the roads unless it was a matter of life or death. That detail would gnaw at detectives. What could have been so urgent that Amanda risked driving out into one of the worst ice storms in decades? The community mobilized quickly. Neighbors bundled in thick coats walked shoulder to shoulder down snow-crusted lanes, calling the mother's name. Search parties gathered at the volunteer fire station, distributing maps and marking off areas to be checked. But as hours stretched into days, the weather buried every potential lead. Snowdrifts rose chest-high, covering ditches and fence lines. If tire tracks had existed, they were erased almost immediately. If Amanda had slid off the road somewhere, the vehicle would have been swallowed in white silence. What struck investigators most was the complete absence of communication. No calls to friends or family, no emergency contacts made to 911 dispatch. Phone lines were down in parts of the county, but Amanda's cell phone records showed nothing either. It was as if she had stepped out of her home and vanished before she could make her destination. The first official statement to the press was cautious. Authorities confirmed that Amanda and her daughter were missing, believed to have left the home during the storm. They asked locals to check barns, sheds, and unheated cabins on their property in case the pair had sought temporary shelter. Nothing turned up. The only sound that carried through the town that week was the steady hum of generators and the crackle of falling branches as the ice refused to let go. For Amanda's relatives, the silence was unbearable. Her sister described pacing the living room, watching snow whip past the windows, convinced she would see headlights appear in the driveway at any moment. Lily's classmates whispered about her empty desk at school, where her pencil case still sat waiting. The absence was heavy, not just in the family home, but across the entire town. Everyone knew something terrible had happened, but the storm had buried it beyond reach. Days turned into a week. Rescue crews from neighboring counties joined the effort, using snowmobiles and even helicopters to survey frozen rivers and tree lines. Still, there was no trace of the car or the passengers inside. Investigators grew frustrated, noting that the search area was simply too vast, the terrain too obscured, every possible lead frozen over. In the aftermath, the Hayes home stood as a chilling monument. The power eventually returned, but the house remained empty, Amanda's belongings frozen in time. Neighbors driving past said it felt wrong to see curtains fluttering in windows when no one was inside. Some refused to walk by at night, unsettled by the thought of what had been left unfinished there. And as the storm thawed into early spring, hope did not return with it. The car was nowhere to be found. The mother and daughter were still missing, and the community was left with a haunting question. In those final moments, where did Amanda take her daughter? And why had the storm left behind not a single trace of where they had gone? The morning after Amanda and Lily vanished, the storm still had its grip on the county. Branches sagged beneath heavy ice, transformers sparked in the distance, and the landscape seemed frozen in time. Yet beneath that silence, the community was stirring. News of the missing mother and daughter spread quickly, first through worried neighbors, then across town, and by midday through every home with a working radio. For those who lived there, the disappearance became more than a headline. It was a call to action. Volunteers arrived at the fire station bundled in scarves and thick gloves, their breath visible in the cold air. Maps were spread out on folding tables, and search grids were marked with pens that barely wrote in the frigid conditions. The sheriff reminded everyone that temperatures were still dangerous, that a person stranded outside for too long could not survive. That reality lent urgency to the search. Groups set out on foot, trudging through waist-high drifts, their boots crunching against ice as they shouted Amanda's name into the frozen stillness. The first priority was the back roads. Police cruisers, chains rattling against their tires, crawled along country lanes, their lights cutting through the dim winter haze. Deputies leaned out of windows, scanning ditches where a vehicle could have disappeared. Every curve, every bend was checked, but snowplows had already passed, burying what might have been crucial evidence under walls of ice. Helicopters circled overhead when the sky cleared, their rotors churning clouds of frost across fields. From above, the land stretched white and unbroken, revealing no hint of the missing car. As hours turned into days, theories spread as quickly as fear. Some residents believed Amanda had panicked when the power went out, deciding to drive toward her sister's home in the next county. Others whispered that maybe she had tried to make it into town for supplies. But there were darker suspicions, too, that someone had taken advantage of the chaos of the storm to harm her. With the car missing, the possibilities multiplied. Had she swerved off the road and been buried in snow? Or had someone intercepted her before she ever reached the highway? The lack of tracks disturbed investigators. In rural cases, vehicles often leave some trace, a faint indentation in the snow, a trail of broken branches, even a misplaced hubcap. But here there was nothing. The storm had moved through with such ferocity that it erased nearly all signs of movement. Searchers described it as trying to find a footprint in a frozen ocean. Every lead seemed swallowed by ice before it could even be followed. Community members grew restless. At night, candlelight vigils were held in the church basement, families huddled together as hymns carried through the walls. Parents held their children tighter, haunted by the idea that if Amanda and Lily could vanish so completely, it could happen to anyone. Farmers left their barns unheated to conserve power, yet still made time to join the search. The desperation to find the two missing faces united people who often spent winters isolated, but it also seeded tension as questions turned to blame. Detectives interviewed anyone who might have seen Amanda's car, stopping at gas stations, diners, and truck stops along the highway. A few recalled a sedan driving cautiously the night of the storm, but no one could confirm the driver. One caller swore they had seen headlights near a wooded stretch before they disappeared, but when officers investigated, They found nothing but frozen brush and a creek swollen with ice. Each possible lead unraveled, leaving behind only frustration. The car became the linchpin of the mystery. Without it, there was no trail to follow. Had Amanda reached the main road? Had she turned back or taken a route no one expected? Investigators considered that she might have crashed into a remote ravine or slid into a frozen pond, the vehicle buried beneath layers of snow. Dive teams were briefly consulted, but the ice was too thick and the waters too numerous to search all at once. The idea lingered. Somewhere out there, beneath the frozen silence, the car could be waiting. By the end of the first week, exhaustion was setting in. Search parties dwindled as residents were forced back to work or confined to homes still without heat. Authorities scaled down efforts but promised to keep watch as thawing weather revealed more of the landscape. Still, the sense of urgency never lifted. People wanted answers, yet the storm had left them with none. For Amanda's family, those days were unbearable. Her sister described driving slowly along country roads, scanning every snowbank as though she might spot the roof of a car peeking through. Lily's grandparents sat by their phone, waiting for a call that never came. Every night ended the same, with silence, unanswered questions, and the gnawing fear that whatever had happened to Amanda and Lily was final. The storm's aftermath seemed almost cruel in how complete it was. The roads grew passable again, power returned, and children went back to school. But Amanda and Lily did not. Their absence was everywhere: an empty chair at the diner where Amanda worked, an unoccupied desk in a first-grade classroom, an abandoned dog pacing behind a locked fence at the Hayes property. And as the community settled uneasily back into its routines, the mystery only deepened. They had scoured the roads, the fields, the backwoods, and found nothing. Helicopters had combed the skies, divers had been consulted, yet still no trace appeared. With each day that passed, the hope of rescue shrank, replaced instead with a haunting question that no one could answer. If Amanda and Lily had vanished into the storm, why had the storm left no evidence behind? When the search for Amanda and Lily brought no answers, suspicion began to turn inward. In missing persons cases, investigators often look first to the family, and in this one, the spotlight quickly shifted to Amanda's husband, Mark Hayes. At the time of the disappearance, he was 32 years old, employed at a manufacturing plant nearly 70 miles away. He told police he'd been working an overnight shift when the storm struck. On paper, it was a clean alibi. But when he appeared before the cameras to plead for his family's safe return, his silence and detached manner unsettled the community far more than his words. Reporters captured him standing stiffly in front of the county courthouse, his jaw clenched, his eyes rarely meeting the lens. He spoke only in clipped sentences, urging anyone with information to come forward. Yet what most remembered was not what he said, but what he didn't. There were no trembling pleas, no visible tears, no desperate appeals that people expected from a grieving husband and father. To many, he seemed cold, almost resentful. And in a town where emotions run deep, his composure looked less like strength and more like indifference. Behind closed doors, detectives began to probe deeper. They contacted his supervisors at the plant, who confirmed he had clocked in at the start of his shift, though snow and ice had prevented some workers from even making it in. Co-workers described him as quiet, keeping to himself that night. Still, investigators wanted more than time cards. They combed through security footage, checked gas receipts, and interviewed every employee who had seen him during those hours. The pieces fit together well enough to hold, but not tightly enough to erase doubt. At the same time, whispers about the Hayes marriage began to surface. Neighbors recalled arguments carried through thin walls during summer evenings when windows were open. One woman told police she had seen Amanda loading bags into her car months earlier after what sounded like a heated fight. She had returned the next morning, but the image lingered. Others remembered Amanda confiding about financial struggles. The couple had fallen behind on mortgage payments, and medical bills from Lily's recurring asthma had only added to the pressure. Stress weighed heavily on the household, and some wondered if the storm had only amplified an already fragile situation. Detectives documented it all. They pulled bank statements showing overdrafts, utilities months past due, and creditors leaving repeated messages. They noted that Amanda had opened a separate checking account in her name, a detail that hinted at a level of independence or distrust in the relationship. Though none of it proved wrongdoing, it painted a backdrop that made speculation almost impossible to silence. In the court of public opinion, the narrative shifted quickly. Some residents insisted that Mark must have known more than he let on. They pointed to his unemotional press appearances as evidence of guilt. They remembered true crime stories where husbands feigned innocence only to later be unmasked as killers. But there were just as many who defended him, arguing that grief takes different forms and that his stoicism was being misread. Those who knew him from the plant described a man who rarely expressed feelings at all, who kept his emotions tightly controlled. To them, his silence wasn't suspicious, it was simply who he was. Still, the rumors spread faster than the storm itself. At the diner where Amanda had once worked, customers whispered over coffee about what might have happened. In the school where Lily's classmates returned to class without her, parents murmured in the hallways, wondering if the father was hiding something. Even the church congregation split quietly down the middle, some praying for his strength, others watching him with wary eyes during Sunday services. Investigators walked a careful line. They could not ignore the possibility of domestic violence, yet they lacked evidence to pursue charges. No signs of struggle had been found in the house. Amanda's packed bag suggested preparation, not coercion. And the missing car complicated everything. Until it was located, the case could not be pinned to accident or crime. But in the absence of physical proof, suspicion clung stubbornly to the man left behind. Mark, for his part, retreated further into himself. He gave only the minimum required interviews, avoided neighbors, and eventually stopped attending community meetings about the search. Some described him as hostile, others as numb. To his relatives, he admitted he could barely sleep, replaying every possibility in his mind, convinced he was being judged by people who had no idea what he was enduring. Yet his refusal to show vulnerability only deepened the divide. Months later, as the case began to cool, the image of his silence lingered. For every person who saw it as proof of guilt, there was another who saw it as the shell of a man broken by loss. Investigators kept him in their files as a person of interest, but had nothing solid to move forward. He remained trapped between pity and suspicion, his reputation frozen just as surely as the storm had frozen the landscape. And as time passed, one fact remained undeniable. The mother and daughter were still gone. The snow had melted, rivers had swelled, and spring had come and gone, yet no sign of Amanda, no trace of Lily, and no hint of their missing car had surfaced. The storm had buried their trail, but it had also left behind something else: doubt. Doubt that would shadow Mark Hayes for years, long after the search parties disbanded. And with every unanswered question, the suspicion only grew stronger, setting the stage for one of the most divisive mysteries the town had ever known. As winter loosened its grip and the ice began to thaw, hope shifted. Families who had braved the bitter cold to search now clung to the idea that melting snow might finally expose something hidden beneath. Fields once buried in drifts were slowly uncovered, and shallow ditches that had been frozen solid began to reveal dark soil and running water. For Amanda's relatives, each new thawing day carried the same expectation that the storm's secrets would surface. But as weeks passed, nothing did. Authorities widened their efforts. Dive teams were brought in to check ponds and creeks that threaded through the county. Holes were cut into the ice, and divers slipped beneath the surface, navigating black water made even murkier by runoff. They searched slowly, hands brushing across silt and weeds, eyes straining for the glint of metal or the shape of tires. Each time they resurfaced, the answer was the same: nothing. The car was not there, and neither were the mother and daughter. Cadaver dogs were deployed across frozen fields and along wooded ridges. Handlers described the animals as restless, confused by a lingering sense of wildlife and the overwhelming wash of decay left behind by the storm's destruction. They tracked and circled, occasionally signaling interest, only for follow-up searches to reveal nothing more than dead livestock hidden beneath collapsed barns. For the investigators walking alongside them, every false alert chipped away at morale. Desperation pushed detectives to consider every possibility. They questioned whether Amanda and Lily might have been picked up by another vehicle the night they vanished. Witnesses were re-interviewed, and one resident recalled a pickup truck idling at a crossroads near Amanda's street. Another claimed to have seen headlights weaving slowly through the storm at an odd hour. Composite sketches of the supposed vehicles were released, prompting a flood of calls. But each tip led to dead ends. Neighbors who had been driving to check on livestock, men stranded trying to get home from late shifts, families evacuating to relatives' houses. The mystery trucks were explained away one by one, leaving investigators back where they started. Local media followed the case relentlessly at first, updating nightly with images of the mother and daughter's smiling faces. News anchors described the ice storm as a thief that had stolen 2 lives in plain sight. But as days stretched into weeks, the story began to slip from the headlines. Other crises emerged: power shortages in neighboring counties, fatal accidents linked to the storm, and eventually, new tragedies that pulled public attention elsewhere. For Amanda's family, that shift was brutal. They watched as the urgency drained away, as coverage that once led broadcasts was reduced to a few sentences buried at the end of reports. Behind the scenes, detectives were struggling. They had exhausted searches of waterways, fields, and rural backroads. They had interviewed co-workers, family, and neighbors. They had checked pawn shops and financial records, looking for any sign of activity in Amanda's name. Nothing appeared. Her bank account sat untouched, her phone inactive, her social security number dormant. It was as if she and Lily had been erased. In town, whispers replaced headlines. At the diner where Amanda had once poured coffee, customers speculated about darker scenarios. Some suggested she had staged her disappearance, planning an escape from a troubled marriage. Others feared she had been abducted, taken advantage of while driving alone through the storm. Parents told their children not to walk alone at night, convinced that if Amanda and Lily could vanish, anyone could. Fear, mixed with rumor, hung heavier than the ice that had bent power lines weeks earlier. For Amanda's family, every day became a battle between dread and faint hope. Her sister drove country roads daily, sometimes pulling over to peer down ravines, half convinced she would spot the missing car at the bottom. Her parents checked their phones compulsively, jumping at every ring, praying for a lead. The silence was its own torment. Without proof of what happened, imagination filled the void with endless worst-case scenarios. Detectives continued to circulate Amanda's photo, pairing it with Lily's school portrait. They mailed flyers to neighboring states, in case the pair had somehow traveled farther than anyone thought possible. But no sightings were confirmed. Each flyer that went unanswered felt like another door slammed shut. The sheriff admitted privately to colleagues that he feared the case would never break, but in public, he maintained a firm voice, promising the family they would not stop searching. By the time spring came fully, the case had grown cold. The thaw revealed broken branches, overturned mailboxes, and debris left behind by the storm, but no trace of Amanda or her daughter. Their car had not surfaced from ditches or ponds. Their clothing had not been found in snowmelt streams. It was as though the storm had swept across the landscape and taken them with it, leaving not even fragments behind. The investigation lingered on in smaller ways. A detective kept their photos pinned to his desk, and every new missing person report was checked against Amanda's details, just in case. But the community itself moved into an uneasy acceptance. At church gatherings, people stopped speaking Amanda's name aloud, lowering their voices when her family entered. At school, Lily's desk was finally cleared, her belongings boxed and returned to her grandmother. Still, the mystery never truly left. Even as life resumed, people carried it in whispers, at gas stations, in barbershops, around kitchen tables. No matter how much time passed, one question remained unsolved. If the storm had hidden the truth, where exactly had it buried it? And why, with all their searching, had no one yet been able to bring it back to light? As the seasons changed and years began to roll by, the search for Amanda and Lily slipped into memory. What had once dominated front pages and nightly broadcasts now lived in quieter spaces, family gatherings where their names were spoken softly, and church basements where candles flickered each winter in their honor. The storm had stolen them in one night, but what followed was a slower erosion, the fading of urgency, the dulling of hope, and the transformation of a case into something closer to legend. The husband, Mark Hayes, did not escape the shadow of suspicion. Though investigators had never charged him, many in the community never shook their doubts. He carried the weight of that judgment until it drove him away. About 5 years after the disappearance, he sold the family home and moved out of state, cutting ties even with relatives who had once defended him. To those left behind, it felt like abandonment, and for some, a kind of confession. His silence remained the loudest sound in the story, leaving the town divided between those who believed in his guilt and those who pitied a man who had lost everything. Meanwhile, the children who had once shared a classroom with Lily grew up with her absence woven into their childhoods. In class photos, a space always seemed to linger where she should have been. Some of her friends remembered the day her desk was cleared, how her pencils and notebooks were placed in a box by the teacher with quiet hands. As they grew older, they spoke of her less, though never without unease. Reunions decades later would still circle back to the memory of a missing classmate, the girl whose life had stopped in first grade while theirs carried on. For Amanda's family, time brought no peace. Each year, on the anniversary of the disappearance, they gathered with candles outside the courthouse steps. The vigils were small, sometimes no more than a dozen people bracing against winter winds, but the message was always the same. They had not forgotten. They spoke to the press when they could, urging anyone with information to come forward, but the coverage dwindled. Some years, no reporters came at all, and they lit the candles in silence, their grief witnessed only by the dark windows of empty buildings around them. Investigators also aged. The sheriff who had first overseen the search retired, his files passed on to younger detectives who had not been there in those frantic early days. The case remained technically open, but it sat among thousands of others in the cold case archives. The binders filled with maps, interview transcripts, and search reports grew brittle with time, their pages handled less and less. For new officers, Amanda and Lily were names on a list, one tragedy among many, lacking the immediacy that once drove dozens of search parties into the snow. Yet the story refused to die completely. It lingered in the way old mysteries do, half cautionary tale, half ghost story. Parents warned their children about driving in storms, invoking Amanda's name as proof of how dangerous the ice could be. Teenagers whispered about the case during long drives down country roads, daring one another to speculate where the missing car might be hidden. Hunters, fishermen, and hikers reported the occasional strange feeling near remote ponds or dense woods, as though they had stumbled too close to the truth. The storm had erased evidence, but it had left behind an unease that seemed to settle over the whole county. Over the years, new theories took root. Some insisted Amanda had planned her disappearance, that financial stress or marital strain had pushed her to run. Others believed the storm had been cover for something darker, an abduction that had gone unnoticed in the chaos. Online forums later resurrected the case, debating it with strangers hundreds of miles away, picking apart timelines and photographs as though solving a puzzle that professionals had abandoned. But in the end, every theory ran into the same wall: the absence of the car. Without it, nothing could be proven, and everything remained speculation. For those closest to Amanda, the inability to bury her properly was the sharpest wound. Her parents kept her childhood room intact, years after she had built a family of her own. Her sister carried boxes of missing person flyers with her through multiple moves, refusing to throw them away even as the edges curled and yellowed. Every phone call from an unfamiliar number sparked the same moment of dread and hope that maybe, after all this time, someone had finally come forward with the truth. But the calls never brought answers, only silence. 18 years passed, generations shifted. The once young search volunteers grew older, some moving away, others passing on. New families settled in town, hearing of the case only in passing, through local gossip or the occasional mention at community events. What had once been an open wound slowly became a scar, still visible, still tender, but part of the town's landscape. For Amanda's relatives, though, the pain never dulled. Each winter storm was a reminder. Each child in a classroom was a reminder. Each empty vigil on the courthouse steps was a reminder that time did not heal all things. It only lengthened the silence. And yet, even in that silence, there was a waiting. The case had not closed, not truly. Somewhere, investigators believed, the truth still existed. Somewhere, Amanda and Lily's final journey had left its mark. The question was whether it would ever be uncovered, or if the storm's grip on that night would remain unbroken forever. 18 winters had passed since Amanda and Lily vanished. In that time, storms had come and gone, the landscape freezing and thawing with the rhythm of the seasons. Most years, the silence of the case remained unbroken. But in the winter of the 18th year, nature shifted in a way no one expected. Temperatures climbed unseasonably high, and for weeks, the county endured a strange thaw. Snow melted from rooftops in January, rivers ran free when they should have been locked in ice, and ponds across the countryside began to shed their frozen armor earlier than anyone could remember. It was at one such pond, on the far edge of the county, where the mystery finally began to stir again. The pond sat off an old trail, visited mostly by hunters in fall and hikers in summer. In winter, it was forgotten, a flat sheet of ice surrounded by bare trees. But that year, when the thaw came, a man walking his dog noticed something beneath the surface. At first, he thought it was a log, dark and half buried in the mud, but as he moved closer, he realized the shape was far too symmetrical. Metal, dull and corroded, caught the light beneath the thinning ice, and behind it, shadows. Authorities arrived within hours, the call sparking both disbelief and urgency. Deputies roped off the area, and specialists from the state police were summoned. By then, the ice had already cracked and receded from the edges, exposing the outline more clearly. It wasn't a log. It was a car. And inside, behind the misty glass and tangled weeds, there were silhouettes. News spread through the town like wildfire. For years, people had whispered about ponds, rivers, and ravines swallowing Amanda's car. Now, here was a pond that had kept a secret for nearly 2 decades, only to give it back. Crowds gathered near the trailhead, held back by deputies who worked to maintain control. Some had been children when Amanda and Lily disappeared. Others had searched the roads themselves, their boots sinking into snow all those years ago. All of them stared with a quiet mix of shock and dread. Recovery was delicate. Crews cut a path through the ice, working slowly to avoid disturbing what lay beneath. Divers confirmed what the hiker had seen. The vehicle was an older model sedan, its frame eaten by rust, its wheels sunk deep into mud. Visibility in the water was almost non-existent, but even in the murk, the outlines of human remains were visible, one in the driver's seat, another in the back. The confirmation sent a ripple of silence through the crowd. As the winch cables were secured, investigators reflected on the strangeness of it all. The pond had been overlooked in the early days of the search. It wasn't far from Amanda's road, but the storm had buried the landscape in snow, and by the time thaw arrived that first spring, attention had shifted elsewhere. Over the years, the pond remained unremarkable, frozen and forgotten. Yet beneath it, the answer had been waiting the entire time. When the vehicle finally broke the surface, dripping with black water and clumps of ice, the sight was devastating. The glass had long since clouded, the paint stripped to dull metal, but the shape was unmistakable. It matched the description of Amanda's car exactly. Family members were not permitted near the scene, but word traveled fast, and Amanda's sister collapsed when she received the call. For 18 years, she had begged for closure. Now it seemed the pond had delivered it in the cruelest possible way. The remains inside were carefully preserved. Photographs were taken before. The car was opened, every angle documented. Forensic teams moved slowly, aware that even the smallest detail could be the key to confirming what had happened that night. Clothing fragments, though deteriorated, were still present. A small shoe was visible near the back seat, a reminder of the child who had been missing since the first grade. For investigators, it was a grim validation. For the town, it was the end of a ghost story that had haunted them for nearly 2 decades. The discovery reignited conversations that had lain dormant for years. Old suspicions resurfaced, old wounds reopened. People asked why the pond hadn't been searched sooner, why divers hadn't cut through its ice in those desperate first weeks. Others wondered whether Amanda had driven there deliberately, or if she had lost control in the storm's chaos. Whatever the truth, the image of the silhouettes locked in ice was enough to reignite the case with an intensity that matched its earliest days. For Amanda's family, grief returned as if no time had passed at all. The vigils they had kept every year now felt like prologues to this moment, as if they had always been waiting for nature itself to release its hold. 18 years of silence ended not with an arrest, not with a confession, but with a thaw, a pond, and the grim outlines of a mother and daughter finally coming into view. And as investigators prepared to pull the remains from the car, one truth became clear to everyone watching. The storm had not taken Amanda and Lily into the wind or into the hands of strangers. It had taken them into the depths of this pond, and now the thaw was finally ready to give them back. The car emerged from the pond with a groan of metal and water, its frame breaking the surface for the first time in nearly 2 decades. Rust had eaten away at its paint, algae clung to every crevice, and shattered glass leaked black water back into the thaw. When recovery crews hauled it onto the bank, deputies and forensic specialists surrounded it in silence. They all knew what they were about to see, and yet no one was prepared for the human outlines still inside. Through the clouded windows, investigators glimpsed the skeletal remains of 2 bodies. The first was in the driver's seat, slumped forward against the steering wheel. The second, much smaller, lay in the back seat. For a moment, the weight of 18 years of unanswered questions pressed down on everyone present. What had been rumor, suspicion, and whispered legend was suddenly undeniable fact. Amanda and her daughter had been inside this car the entire time. The vehicle was towed to a secure facility where the evidence could be examined under controlled conditions. The process was painstaking. Forensic teams worked in protective suits, carefully draining the interior of the vehicle, cataloging every item that emerged from the sludge. They photographed every angle before disturbing a single bone, every object logged before being moved. The smell of stagnant pond water clung to the air, mixing with the sterile sharpness of latex and disinfectant. It was less an autopsy and more an excavation, each detail peeled back like layers of history. Amanda's remains were found still belted in place, the rusted buckle fused against her side. The skeletal positioning suggested she had been gripping the wheel in her final moments. Her skull showed no fractures, no blunt force trauma, no signs of foul play. Lily's smaller frame was curled in the back seat, her bones pressed tightly against the fabric of the seat that had partially survived the years underwater. The condition of the remains pointed not to violence, but to sudden submersion. Evidence within the car told its own story. A flashlight, its batteries corroded and split, lay on the passenger seat. A wool blanket, waterlogged and rotting, had been bundled near the child's remains. Food cans, the same ones noted missing from Amanda's kitchen all those years earlier, floated loose in the sludge at the bottom of the car. Investigators concluded that Amanda had indeed been preparing for an emergency when she left home. These were not items someone fleeing a family or staging a disappearance would have taken. They were the supplies of a mother bracing for survival. What startled investigators most were the conditions of the vehicle itself. The gearshift was locked in drive. The headlights were still switched on, though long dead, and the driver's side window was cracked open just slightly, as though in a frantic attempt to escape. The steering wheel showed deep wear marks, consistent with someone gripping it hard in panic. The scene suggested haste, confusion, and an accident that unfolded in seconds rather than a planned disappearance. Forensic specialists ruled out mechanical tampering. The car showed no signs of sabotage. Instead, the undercarriage bore long scrapes consistent with sliding across ice and rocks. Mud packed deep into the wheel wells indicated the car had left the road and plunged downward before coming to rest in the pond. Overhead maps showed that in 2005, the road leading toward the pond had been unplowed during the storm. If Amanda had attempted to navigate it, blinded by snow and desperate to find safety, she could easily have lost control. The medical examiner confirmed what many suspected. Both Amanda and Lily had drowned. The water, frigid in that storm, would have filled the vehicle within minutes. The temperature alone would have stolen their strength almost instantly, numbing hands and lungs before they could even attempt escape. For investigators, the implications were devastating. Amanda had not been abducted. She had not run away. She had fought to save her child and lost against the storm itself. The discovery reignited the case, though in a different way than before. Detectives poured back into the details, retracing Amanda's final known steps, confirming timelines with the benefit of hindsight. They reviewed the initial search maps and saw, with fresh eyes, how easily the pond had been overlooked. At the time, snow had been piled high along its banks. By the time thaw came in spring, attention had shifted, and divers had been sent elsewhere. It was a reminder of how fragile investigations could be, how one missed location could hold the answer for decades. For Amanda's family, the confirmation was shattering. They had lived in a purgatory of suspicion and silence for 18 years. Now they were forced to accept the reality of those final moments, frozen beneath the ice. Her sister later told reporters that she imagined Amanda gripping the wheel, the blanket in reach, trying desperately to protect her daughter as water rushed in. For Lily's childhood friends, now grown, the confirmation ended years of haunting questions, but replaced them with grief, as sharp as the day she disappeared. The town, too, reeled from the forensic awakening. For years, speculation had centered on the husband, on foul play, on dark theories whispered in diners and church pews. But the evidence inside the car dismantled those suspicions. This was not a crime, but an accident sealed in ice. The details, panic, haste, drowned headlights, revealed not conspiracy, but tragedy. And yet for many, the shift brought no relief, only guilt for the accusations they had once made. Still, even as investigators announced the preliminary findings, one question remained unanswered. Why had Amanda left that night at all? Why had she chosen to drive into the storm rather than wait it out at home? It was a decision that would never be fully explained, but one that had cost 2 lives. And as the community absorbed the forensic truth, they braced themselves for the next chapter, reconstructing the night that had haunted them for nearly 20 years, to finally understand how a mother's desperate choice had ended in silence beneath a frozen pond. In the weeks after the car was pulled from the pond, investigators set out to retrace Amanda's final journey. For 18 years, her disappearance had been a puzzle with missing pieces. Now, with the car recovered and the remains confirmed, those pieces could finally be placed on the board. What emerged was not a tale of conspiracy or malice, but of desperation colliding with circumstance on one of the worst nights the county had ever seen. Detectives began with the timeline. Amanda and Lily were last seen in their home the evening the storm descended. The power had flickered across the county, and by late night, many households were plunged into freezing darkness. Amanda's sister recalled that Amanda had been nervous about being cut off, especially with Lily's recurring asthma. The lack of heat and phone service may have pushed her to make a choice, to leave the safety of her home and drive toward help, despite the storm raging outside. Forensic analysis of the car revealed details that supported that theory. The flashlight and canned food found inside suggested Amanda had packed quickly but intentionally. The blanket near Lily's remains hinted at a mother preparing for the possibility of being stranded. It wasn't the behavior of someone running away. It was the behavior of someone determined to protect her child. The reconstructed route was chilling in its simplicity. From her driveway, Amanda would have turned onto the nearest county road. In normal weather, it was a short, winding drive toward the main highway, where she could have continued to her sister's house or even the local hospital if Lily's condition worsened. But that night, the roads had been unplowed, coated in thick ice. Streetlights were out, leaving the path in near-total darkness. Deputies remembered entire stretches where even snowplows had refused to go, judging them too dangerous. Beneath the thawing snow, investigators discovered faint traces of tire ruts preserved like scars in the frozen mud. The marks matched the dimensions of Amanda's sedan. They showed a path weaving along the county road before veering off sharply near a curve. At that spot, the earth dipped toward the pond. In daylight, the water would have been visible, but under the storm, it would have looked like solid ground, buried beneath white drifts. Accident reconstruction experts explained how quickly it could have happened. With limited visibility, Amanda may have mistaken the edge of the pond for an open stretch of road. The sedan's tires, already struggling against ice, could have slid sideways, pulling her downhill. Once the car broke the surface of the pond, the weight of the vehicle combined with the thinness of early ice would have dragged them under within seconds. The frigid water would have stolen their strength almost immediately. Any cries for help would have been swallowed by the storm's howling winds. The most haunting detail was how completely the pond had concealed the accident. When divers first examined the car, they noted that the ice had sealed the surface within hours of the crash. Snow then covered it entirely, blending it into the landscape. By the time searchers fanned across the area days later, there had been no sign, no open water, no broken ice, no tire tracks left visible. To those trudging past, it had been just another frozen pond among dozens. Detectives reviewing old maps realized that the pond had not even been included in the initial list of dive sites. With limited manpower and so many waterways across the county, some had been prioritized over others. That single oversight had left Amanda and Lily hidden in plain sight for nearly 20 years. It was not incompetence, but the sheer enormity of the storm's aftermath, a landscape transformed into a uniform sheet of ice and snow where no pond or ravine looked different from the next. For Amanda's family, the reconstruction brought painful clarity. They could picture her, bundling Lily in the back seat, clutching the steering wheel with white knuckles, fighting to keep the car steady on the road. They could imagine her headlights cutting a narrow path through blinding snow, her heart pounding as the house disappeared in a rearview mirror. And they could see the moment it all went wrong, the slip, the plunge, the sudden silence beneath the ice. It was a nightmare given shape, a truth that was both devastating and undeniable. The town, too, was forced to confront the reality. For years, suspicion had turned inward, accusations dividing families and neighbors. But the tire marks in the frozen mud and the car at the bottom of the pond told a different story. Amanda had not been a victim of foul play, nor had she abandoned her child. She had been a mother caught in a storm, trying to protect her daughter, undone by a decision that any parent might have made in her place. Investigators concluded their reconstruction with a final note. Amanda's last drive had been measured not in miles, but in seconds. The distance from her driveway to the pond was less than 3 miles. From the time she left her home to the moment the car sank, only minutes had passed. 18 years of questions collapsed into a heartbreakingly brief timeline, one that underscored just how quickly lives can be swallowed by circumstance. And yet, even with the reconstruction, unease lingered. The answers were there, but they brought no comfort. They could not undo the years of silence, the suspicions cast on Amanda's husband, or the childhood stolen from Lily. They could only reveal the truth that had been hidden beneath ice all along, that on that storm-stricken night, Amanda and her daughter had been there, lost in the dark, just beyond reach. When investigators announced their findings to the public, the revelation rippled through the community like an aftershock. For 18 years, people had lived under the weight of suspicion and rumor. Now the truth was inescapable. Amanda and Lily's disappearance had been nothing more than a tragic accident. The car in the pond, the skeletal remains inside, the forensic evidence of drowning, all of it erased the darker narratives that had grown in the vacuum of uncertainty. Yet the collapse of those theories did not bring peace. It reopened wounds that had never fully healed. For nearly 2 decades, the husband, Mark Hayes, had lived under a shadow, cast not only by the loss of his wife and daughter, but by the judgment of his own neighbors. His silence in press interviews, his stoic composure, and his decision to eventually move away had all been seen as signs of guilt. Some were convinced he had staged the disappearance. Others whispered of violence behind closed doors. Families in town quietly told their children not to trust him, and at church gatherings he had felt the weight of eyes lingering on him. Now, in the harsh light of forensic clarity, all of that suspicion evaporated. He had been innocent all along. But clearing his name came with no sense of victory. For Mark, the announcement was salt in a wound. He had lost his family once to the storm, and then again to the judgment of the town. Now the truth left him with nothing but the bitter knowledge that he had been punished for a crime that never existed. Friends who had once kept their distance offered apologies, but the years of suspicion had already eroded relationships. His departure years earlier had not been an escape from guilt, but from a community that had slowly turned its back on him. For those who had accused him, guilt began to spread like a quiet sickness. Neighbors who had whispered about his supposed involvement replayed their words, ashamed. Some admitted privately that they had needed someone to blame because the alternative, that a mother and daughter could vanish so completely in an accident, was too unbearable to face. To believe in foul play had been easier than believing in silence, but now they had to face the fact that their theories had only deepened another man's suffering. The collapse of abduction theories also left many reeling. Over the years, parents had comforted themselves by imagining Amanda and Lily had been taken far away, that perhaps one day the daughter might resurface alive. The image of a grown Lily appearing at their door or walking into town had been a fragile hope some clung to. The discovery in the pond ended that possibility abruptly. She had been there all along, her short life ending the same night she vanished. For classmates now in their 20s, the truth was devastating. The idea of their missing friend had always carried a small flame of hope. That flame was now extinguished. Families who had joined the original searches struggled as well. They remembered trudging through snow, dragging sleds of supplies, shining flashlights into barns and sheds. Some had walked directly past the pond, never realizing the answers lay beneath their feet. For them, the revelation was cruel in its simplicity. The storm had hidden the car so completely that even the most determined efforts had missed it. To know that they had been so close to the truth, yet powerless to uncover it, left a lingering sense of failure. Detectives who had retired years earlier also revisited the case with heavy hearts. Some admitted in interviews that the pond had been overlooked because of sheer numbers, too many waterways, too little time, and a storm that had buried everything in uniform ice. Others said they had always suspected an accident, but could never prove it without the car. The final discovery confirmed what they had feared all along, that Amanda and Lily had been lost within miles of home, their absence stretched into decades only because of nature's concealment. As the community processed the collapse of the old theories, it confronted an uncomfortable truth about human nature. In the absence of facts, people had created their own stories. Those stories had fueled suspicion, divided neighbors, and haunted an innocent man. Now, stripped away, they left behind only the stark image of a car beneath the ice, a mother gripping the wheel, a child in the back seat. There was no villain, no conspiracy, only tragedy. Amanda's family, though relieved to finally have answers, carried a different burden. For years they had spoken her name in vigils, pleaded for leads, and endured the endless swirl of rumors. Now they had to reconcile themselves with the reality that she had not been betrayed by her husband, not abducted by strangers, but undone by the storm itself. Her sister told reporters she felt robbed twice, first by the storm, and then by the years of doubt that had turned grief into suspicion. The town eventually gathered for a memorial, one that brought together people who had once stood on opposite sides of suspicion. The church filled with faces aged by nearly 2 decades, voices quieter than before. Mark did not attend, but his absence was noted with regret. The memorial was not just for Amanda and Lily. It was also for the years stolen by mistrust. And yet, even as flowers were laid and candles lit, the final truth carried no comfort. The accident explained everything, but it did not heal the scars left behind. The storm had not only taken 2 lives, it had fractured a community, driven away a father, and silenced hope for nearly 20 years. The truth was undeniable now, but it was a truth that offered no redemption. Only the image of the pond remained, its waters finally thawed, its secret exposed, a reminder of how a single night had changed everything. The investigation's final conclusion was as heartbreaking as it was undeniable. On that brutal winter night, Amanda had bundled Lily into the car, carrying with her the few supplies she thought might keep them safe. When the heat failed and the storm grew worse, she made the choice every parent fears. She drove out into the blinding ice, hoping to reach warmth or help. But in those conditions, visibility was near zero. The road twisted past the pond, and within seconds of losing control, the sedan left the pavement and plunged down the embankment. The water swallowed them instantly, sealing their fate before anyone knew they were gone. The storm had done the rest. By morning, the pond was frozen solid, snow concealing the broken ice, hiding the car from view. Searchers trudged past within days, unaware that the answer lay just yards away. Over time, the pond became indistinguishable from any other, its surface locking away the secret for 18 long years. It was not malice that had taken Amanda and Lily, not conspiracy or violence, but circumstance. They had been there all along, held in silence until nature itself decided to release them. For the family, the revelation was both devastating and strangely merciful. At last, they could bury Amanda and Lily properly, no longer bound to annual vigils and endless unanswered questions. The memorial service drew the town together, uniting those who had once been divided by suspicion and rumor. Candles flickered not in protest or demand, but in grief and remembrance. For the first time in nearly 2 decades, the names Amanda and Lily Hayes were spoken without speculation, only with sorrow. The pond's final secret had stripped away every theory, every doubt, every cruel whisper that had haunted the family. What remained was the simplest and most painful truth. A mother trying to save her child, undone by a storm too powerful to survive. For the town, closure did not erase the tragedy, but it finally allowed them to let go of the fear and suspicion that had lingered for years. And as the waters of that pond thawed and froze again with each passing winter, the memory of Amanda and Lily remained, 2 lives claimed not by crime, but by the merciless grip of nature on a single night that changed everything.